This vehicle is showing as stolen. Step out of the car.
That's incorrect. This is my vehicle.
Then explain how you got it.
I will provide my identification and proof of ownership.
Step out of the vehicle.
You ever have one of those moments where you think you're seeing things wrong? Where reality just doesn't add up? Picture this, a federal judge. In her own driveway. Getting arrested for stealing her own car. The dashboard camera caught it all, and what happened next would expose a pattern of injustice that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The dashboard camera captured every second. Every word. Every violation. What it recorded would become the most expensive mistake in the department's history. If you stand against racial profiling and police overreach, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Your engagement sends a message that accountability matters. Let's make sure stories like this are never forgotten. The red Mercedes sat perfectly centered in the driveway of a pristine colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive, its engine still ticking as it cooled. It was 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of suburban quiet where the most exciting sound was usually a neighbor's lawn mower or a dog barking at the mailman. Judge Carolyn Anderson had just returned from federal court, where she'd spent the morning presiding over a complex civil rights case involving unlawful detention. The irony of that would reveal itself within minutes. At 52 years old, Anderson represented the culmination of decades of sacrifice and excellence. She'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood where her parents, a postal worker and a school cafeteria manager, had impressed upon her a singular truth: education was the ladder, and she'd better climb. Harvard Law School, summa cum laude. 15 years as a federal prosecutor with a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. Another decade in private practice, building a reputation for methodical preparation and unshakable composure. Then the call from Washington, a presidential appointment to the federal bench, a recognition that her commitment to justice wasn't just professional. It was cellular. She'd built her career on precedent, procedure, and the belief that the law, when applied correctly, could be an instrument of equity. She believed in the system. Trusted it. Served it. The patrol car pulled up behind her Mercedes without lights, without announcement. Officer Gary Rogers approached the driver's side with his hand resting on his service weapon, his posture rigid with assumed authority. His cruiser idled in the street, engine rumbling, as he moved with the deliberate swagger of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Anderson noticed him in her rearview mirror. At first, she assumed he was responding to a call in the neighborhood, maybe a noise complaint, maybe a wellness check. She gathered her briefcase from the passenger seat, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and reached for the door handle. His voice cut through the quiet afternoon like gravel dragged across glass. He demanded her license and registration immediately. She turned, confused, keys still in her hand. The confusion wasn't fear, not yet. It was the intellectual dissonance of a woman who'd just driven 3 miles from a federal courthouse to her own home, now being treated like a suspect. Her mind, trained to assess situations through the framework of law and procedure, struggled to find the legal basis for the stop. She informed him that she lived at this address, that this was her vehicle, and asked if there was a problem. Roger's jaw tightened. His hand remained on his weapon. He repeated his demand for license and registration, claiming the vehicle matched a stolen car report. Anderson felt the first flicker of something darker than confusion. She'd seen this dynamic before, from the bench, in case files, in testimony from plaintiffs who described the exact tone Rogers now used. Aggressive without cause. Dismissive without reason. She kept her voice measured, calm, the same tone she used when addressing nervous attorneys in her courtroom. She acknowledged there must be a mistake, stated that this was her home, identified herself as Judge Carolyn Anderson, and expressed willingness to provide identification while requesting to understand the basis for the stop. Rogers stepped closer, his shadow falling across her window. He ordered her to step out of the car slowly with her hands visible. She complied. Not because she feared him, not in the traditional sense, but because she understood the mathematics of escalation. A black woman in an upscale neighborhood. A white officer with assumptions already calcified. The equation was older than both of them, and it rarely solved for justice without documentation. Anderson stepped out with her hands visible, palms open, movements deliberate. Her briefcase remained on the passenger seat. Her keys dangled from her left hand. She wore a navy suit, the fabric expensive but understated, the uniform of someone who wielded authority without needing to announce it. She repeated her identity as Judge Carolyn Anderson, stated that she sat on the federal bench for this district, and requested that he verify her credentials before proceeding further. Rogers' expression didn't shift. If anything, it hardened. He dismissed her claim with sarcasm, comparing it to someone claiming to be the governor, and demanded her license and registration for the last time. The refusal to verify was the tell. Not incompetence, willful dismissal. Anderson's legal mind cataloged the details even as her heart rate elevated, no reasonable suspicion articulated, no attempt to confirm her identity through dispatch, no stolen vehicle report that could possibly match her registered Mercedes with her name on the title. She reached slowly for her purse, narrating each movement aloud. She announced she was retrieving her identification from her purse in the vehicle, and that her movements were slow and deliberate. Rogers watched her with the kind of intensity that made even innocence feel like guilt. She handed him her license, the one that listed this address, the one with her photograph, the one that should have ended this interaction in 30 seconds. He glanced at it. Barely. Then handed it back. He stated that the identification didn't prove the car wasn't stolen, suggesting she could have stolen both the car and the ID. He ordered her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The absurdity of it would have been laughable in any other context. A federal judge being accused of stealing her own identity along with her own car. But there was no humor in Rogers' face, no hesitation in his movements as he reached for his handcuffs. Anderson's voice remained steady, but now it carried a sharper edge. She formally requested that he verify her identity through dispatch before proceeding. She stated clearly that she was not resisting, that she was cooperating fully, but that what he was doing lacked probable cause. Rogers grabbed her wrist and accused her of resisting by arguing. He repeated his order for her to turn around. The metal cuffs clicked shut, cold against her wrists. Too tight. Deliberately so. Anderson felt the bite of steel against bone, felt the indignity of being restrained in her own driveway, and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. Anderson's voice remained steady, but now it carried a sharper edge. She formally requested that he verify her identity through dispatch before proceeding. She stated clearly that she was not resisting, that she was cooperating fully, but that what he was doing lacked probable cause. Rogers grabbed her wrist and accused her of resisting by arguing. He repeated his order for her to turn around. The metal cuffs clicked shut, cold against her wrists. Too tight. Deliberately so. Anderson felt the bite of steel against bone, felt the indignity of being restrained in her own driveway, and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. The first backup unit arrived at 2:28 p.m., lights flashing red and blue across the neat lawns and painted shutters of Maple Ridge Drive. Then another. By 2:35, 3 patrol cars formed a barricade of authority in front of Anderson's home, transforming a residential street into a crime scene without a crime. More neighbors emerged. Some stood on porches. Others gathered in clusters on sidewalks, phones raised, recording. The spectacle had its own gravity now, pulling attention from every direction. Anderson sat motionless in the back of Rogers' cruiser, her wrists aching, her mind still cataloging violations with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 decades in courtrooms. Officer Elena Martinez arrived with the second wave. She was 10 years younger than Rogers, with 6 years on the force and a reputation for asking questions that made senior officers uncomfortable. She approached Rogers with the practiced neutrality of someone navigating department politics, but her eyes tracked the scene with growing confusion. She asked what they had. Rogers gestured toward the Mercedes, his movements quick and defensive. He explained that the vehicle matched a stolen car report, that the suspect had refused to provide proper identification, and had gotten aggressive when questioned. Martinez glanced at the Mercedes, then at the house, then at the woman sitting calmly in the back of the patrol car. Something about the composition didn't align. The car was pristine, registered plates visible. The house showed signs of occupancy, mail on the porch table, a wreath on the door. The woman in custody wore a suit that probably cost more than Martinez made in a week. Martinez asked for the report number. Rogers fumbled with his radio, stating he was verifying that information. Martinez walked toward the patrol car. Anderson's eyes met hers through the window, no panic, no anger, just a steady gaze that held more authority than most people Martinez had arrested in her entire career. She opened the door and asked the woman to state her name. Anderson's voice carried the same measured calm it had maintained for 30 minutes. She identified herself as Judge Carolyn Anderson, stated that she sat on the federal bench for this district, that she lived at this address, and that the Mercedes was her vehicle. She documented that she had been detained without probable cause for approximately 30 minutes, that she had requested credential verification multiple times, and that her requests had been denied. Martinez felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard that name before, seen it in department briefings, in legal journals, in news coverage of civil rights cases. She turned back toward Rogers, her voice dropping low as she asked whether he had run the woman's identification. Rogers' jaw tightened. He defended his actions by noting that many people falsely claimed to be lawyers, judges, or senators when stopped by police. Martinez ordered him to run the identification immediately. Martinez walked back to her cruiser and contacted dispatch. The response came back within 90 seconds. Federal Judge Carolyn Anderson. Active appointment. No warrants. No criminal history. Vehicle registration matched the Mercedes in the driveway, same plates, same VIN, registered to Carolyn J. Anderson at 742 Maple Ridge Drive. Martinez's hands tightened on her radio. She walked back to Rogers, her expression carefully blank. She informed him that the woman was exactly who she claimed to be, a federal judge, and that the vehicle was registered to her at this address. She added that there was no stolen vehicle report matching this make, model, or plate. Rogers' face flushed. He insisted the woman had been acting suspicious and wouldn't comply with his orders. Martinez cut him off, pointing out that the woman had told him who she was multiple times, and that he hadn't verified her identity. The tension between them stretched taut. Other officers watched from a distance, sensing the shift. Martinez moved past Rogers and returned to the patrol car. She opened the door and began removing Anderson's handcuffs, her movements gentle, apologetic in their carefulness. She addressed Anderson by her proper title, apologized, and informed her that she was free to go. The cuffs came off. Anderson's wrists bore deep red marks where the metal had pressed against skin for 35 minutes. She rubbed them slowly, blood flow returning with a prickling sensation that bordered on painful. When she spoke, her voice remained composed, but now it carried an undertone of something harder. She thanked Officer Martinez and requested the names and badge numbers of everyone present. Martinez provided them without hesitation, writing each on a card from her pocket. Anderson accepted it, tucking it carefully into her suit jacket. She stepped out of the patrol car, legs slightly stiff from the confined position, and turned to face Rogers. He stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, expression caught between defiance and recognition that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. He addressed her by her title and attempted to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding, suggesting they could forget the whole thing. Anderson's response cut through his sentence with surgical precision. She stated clearly that there would be no forgetting, that what had happened that day eroded public trust in every traffic stop and every interaction between law enforcement and the community. She detailed that he had detained a federal judge in her own driveway for 35 minutes based on no probable cause, had refused to verify easily confirmable facts, and had threatened citizens who tried to intervene on her behalf. She concluded that this was not a misunderstanding but a violation of constitutional rights. Mrs. Davis approached from across the street, her phone still recording. She informed Anderson that she had captured everything on video, from the moment the handcuffs were placed. Mr. Mitchell joined her, his terrier panting at his feet. He confirmed that he had also recorded the incident and would testify to exactly what he had witnessed. Others nodded. A man in running clothes. A woman who'd been getting mail. A teenager who'd stopped skateboarding to watch. They formed a loose circle of witnesses, their presence a silent indictment. Anderson thanked each of them, collecting names and contact information with the methodical thoroughness of someone building a case. Because that's exactly what she was doing. By 2:52 p.m., the patrol cars began to disperse. Neighbors returned to their homes, to their interrupted afternoons, carrying with them the uncomfortable knowledge that what they'd witnessed shouldn't have happened but somehow did. Anderson walked up her driveway, past the Mercedes that had been the alleged crime, past the mailbox with her name on it, through the front door of the house she'd owned for 8 years. She closed the door behind her and stood in the foyer, alone for the first time in 40 minutes. The silence pressed against her ears. She looked down at her wrists, the red marks already beginning to fade to purple. She felt the weight of her briefcase in her right hand, still carrying the case files from this morning's civil rights hearing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She called her husband first. Then her daughter. Then 2 colleagues from the federal courthouse who needed to know before word spread through the legal community like wildfire. Because it would spread. A federal judge arrested in her own driveway, the story practically told itself. By 5 p.m., 3 attorneys had called offering representation. By 6 p.m., the story had reached the local NAACP chapter. By 7 p.m., a reporter from the city's largest newspaper was leaving voicemails. Anderson sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, documenting every detail she could remember. Time stamps. Exact words. The temperature of the afternoon. The smell of Mrs. Davis's garden hose running. The way Roger's hand never left his weapon. The deliberate tightness of the handcuffs. Every piece of evidence that would matter when this moved from driveway to courtroom. Sometimes injustice reveals itself in broad daylight, witnessed by neighbors with phones and captured by cameras meant to ensure accountability. Have you seen profiling happen in your community, regardless of who the victim was or what position they held? Type yes in the comments if you believe this kind of bias exists at every level. Share this story if you think sunlight is the best disinfectant for systemic problems. 8 miles away, at the police department headquarters, a supervisor pulled the dashcam footage from Roger's patrol car. Standard procedure for any arrest. He expected to see a routine vehicle theft stop, maybe some confusion, nothing unusual. What he found would change everything. The footage began with Rogers approaching the Mercedes. Standard. Then Anderson's calm responses. Her clear identification. Her multiple requests for verification. All documented. But there was something else. Something the supervisor had to rewind twice to confirm he was hearing correctly. Anderson's voice, quiet and steady throughout her detention, narrating each constitutional violation in real time. Describing the lack of probable cause. Noting the failure to verify. Cataloging each procedural failure with the precision of someone who didn't just know the law, she'd spent decades applying it. The supervisor sat back in his chair, the footage still playing on his screen, and reached for his phone to call the department's attorney. This wasn't just an unlawful arrest. It was a self-documenting case study in civil rights violations, narrated by a federal judge, preserved forever on the department's own equipment. The footage would be reviewed by Internal Affairs by morning. And what they'd find there would expose far more than one officer's mistake. The sergeant assigned to review Rogers' incident report arrived at his desk at 7:30 a.m. Wednesday morning with coffee still steaming in a paper cup and no expectation of anything unusual. Vehicle theft stops happened weekly. Most were resolved with apologies and paperwork. He read Rogers' report first. The language was careful, sanitized. The report claimed the subject had been acting suspiciously, had refused to provide adequate identification, had become argumentative and non-compliant. It stated that the arrest had been made based on reasonable suspicion of vehicle theft and resisting arrest. Then he watched the dashcam footage. The discrepancy wasn't subtle. It was absolute. Anderson's voice emerged from the speakers with crystalline clarity, her narration threading through the entire encounter like a legal brief delivered in real time. She documented that no stolen vehicle report had been verified, that detention had occurred without reasonable suspicion, that her request for credential verification had been denied, and that Fourth Amendment violations were occurring at specific timestamps. The sergeant watched the full 35 minutes. Watched Rogers refuse to verify easily confirmable information. Watched him threaten neighbors. Watched Anderson maintain composure that most people couldn't sustain under far less stressful circumstances. By 9 a.m., the footage was on the police chief's desk. By 10 a.m., Internal Affairs had opened an investigation. By 11 a.m., someone in the department leaked the story to a reporter who'd been covering police misconduct cases for 15 years. The internal investigation moved with unusual speed, driven partly by the severity of the violation and partly by the fact that the victim was a sitting federal judge whose legal expertise made litigation a certainty, not a possibility. They pulled Rogers' personnel file. 14 complaints over 8 years. Most involved traffic stops. Most involved black motorists. Most had been dismissed with minimal investigation or marked as unfounded. Traffic stop data told an even clearer story. Rogers stopped black drivers at 3 times the rate of white drivers in his patrol area. His searches of black motorists yielded contraband at rates no different than the baseline, meaning his suspicions were no more accurate, just more frequent. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was statistically damning. The department's failure wasn't just in one officer. It was systemic. Complaints ignored. Patterns undocumented. Training inadequate. Supervision absent. Anderson spent Wednesday consulting with 3 civil rights attorneys, each bringing different expertise: Fourth Amendment violations, qualified immunity challenges, systemic discrimination claims. She provided them with her own documentation, neighbor videos, the names of witnesses, and the knowledge that the department's dash cam had captured her real-time legal analysis. By Thursday morning, she'd made her decision. No settlement discussions. No quiet resolution. This needed sunlight and precedent. The federal lawsuit was filed on Friday morning, 4 days after the arrest. Named defendants: Officer Gary Rogers, individually. Sergeant Thomas Brennan, Rogers' direct supervisor. Lieutenant Christopher Hayes, who dismissed previous complaints against Rogers. And the police department itself. Allegations: Fourth Amendment violations, unlawful seizure without probable cause. 14th Amendment violations, racially motivated policing. Failure to supervise. Failure to train. Pattern and practice of racial discrimination. The complaint was 43 pages long. Methodical. Devastating. Written with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years understanding exactly how the law worked and where it failed. Media response was immediate. National outlets picked up the story within hours. Legal experts described it as a textbook case of racial profiling. The phrase, federal judge arrested in her own driveway, became shorthand for the absurdity of bias that transcended even institutional authority. Rogers was placed on administrative leave pending the internal investigation. 2 weeks later, after the internal probe concluded he'd violated multiple department policies, he was terminated. No pension. No severance. Just termination and the knowledge that his career in law enforcement was over. The lawsuit moved into discovery, and what emerged painted a picture larger than one officer's bias. Traffic stop data across the department showed similar disparities. Black drivers comprised 18% of the city's population but 41% of traffic stops. Search rates were disproportionate. Use of force statistics showed clear racial patterns. And disciplinary records revealed a culture that protected officers rather than addressing complaints. 23 officers had 5 or more complaints involving racial bias. None had faced significant discipline. Training on implicit bias was a 2-hour PowerPoint presentation conducted once every 3 years. Civilian oversight existed on paper but had no enforcement power. The Department of Justice sent a letter indicating they were reviewing the situation for potential federal intervention, a polite way of saying the entire department might soon be under a consent decree. Community response divided along predictable lines. Rallies organized outside the police headquarters. The NAACP issued statements praising Anderson's courage in pursuing accountability. Other victims of questionable stops began contacting civil rights attorneys, their cases now viable in ways they hadn't been before Anderson's lawsuit created precedent and momentum. For Rogers, the consequences extended beyond employment. His name became synonymous with racial profiling. Job applications in other law enforcement agencies went unanswered. Private security firms declined to interview him. He moved to a different county, changed his phone number, and tried to rebuild a life that had collapsed in 35 minutes. The discovery phase revealed the video footage's full significance. Legal experts analyzed it frame by frame, noting Anderson's deliberate narration. She documented each violation as it occurred, not in anger, not in panic, but with the methodical precision of someone creating an evidentiary record. Law schools began using the footage in constitutional law courses. Police academies incorporated it into training on civil rights and de-escalation. What started as one officer's catastrophic mistake had become a teaching tool, a case study in what not to do and what happens when bias meets authority without accountability. The footage showed something else too, something quieter but equally powerful. Anderson's composure under circumstances designed to humiliate. Her refusal to respond to provocation with anything except calm documentation. Her transformation of victimization into evidence. Community activists called it resistance through endurance. Legal scholars called it brilliant litigation strategy. Anderson called it survival with purpose. 3 months after the arrest, 7 other plaintiffs joined a class action lawsuit alleging similar patterns of racial bias in traffic stops. Their cases lacked the dramatic profile of a federal judge arrested at home, but they shared the same fundamental violation, being treated as suspicious because of their race, stopped without justification, subjected to authority without accountability. The department's legal costs mounted. Insurance carriers sent letters warning that the city's liability coverage might not extend to constitutional violations with such clear evidentiary support. City council members began asking uncomfortable questions about why complaint patterns hadn't triggered reforms years earlier. By 6 months post-incident, the case had become bigger than Anderson, bigger than Rogers, bigger than one suburban traffic stop. It was about systems that protected their own, about data ignored until it became litigation, about how injustice could persist in plain sight until someone with resources and expertise forced it into the light. Anderson continued presiding over her federal docket, her reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the incident. Attorneys appeared in her courtroom knowing she understood constitutional rights not just theoretically but experientially. Her rulings on Fourth Amendment issues carried added weight, she'd lived the violation she was now interpreting. The dashcam footage continued circulating. Viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Analyzed. Discussed. Becoming shorthand for a larger conversation about race, policing, and the gap between law as written and law as experienced. And somewhere in that footage, quietly threading through 35 minutes of documentation, was Anderson's voice, steady, precise, turning injustice into evidence, violation into education, humiliation into reform. 18 months after Officer Rogers placed handcuffs on Judge Carolyn Anderson in her own driveway, the case finally reached trial. Settlement negotiations had collapsed 3 times, not over money, but over reforms. The city offered $250,000 and vague promises of policy review. Anderson's attorneys demanded structural change, mandatory implicit bias training, civilian oversight with enforcement power, public release of traffic stop data, and mechanisms for real accountability. The city refused. Anderson proceeded to trial. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unambiguous: $850,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. But more significantly, the judge presiding over the case, a colleague of Anderson's from a different district, issued an injunction requiring the police department to implement comprehensive reforms within 90 days. Implicit bias training, conducted quarterly by external experts. Civilian review board with subpoena power and binding recommendations. Public dashboard displaying traffic stop data broken down by race, neighborhood, and outcome. Early warning system to flag officers with complaint patterns. Disciplinary matrix that actually imposed consequences. The legal victory was complete. But the human costs had already been paid. Rogers' life had unraveled with the same systematic precision Anderson had used to document his violations. Fired from the police department, he'd applied to 12 other agencies in neighboring counties. All declined. Private security firms found reasons not to hire him. His name now carried liability no employer wanted to assume. His marriage dissolved 6 months after the termination. Financial pressures, the stress of unemployment, the constant media attention whenever the case resurfaced. He moved to a rural county 2 hours away, took a job in warehouse logistics, and stopped answering calls from former colleagues. His pension, the one financial cushion he'd counted on, was under review. Termination for cause sometimes voided pension rights, and the department's attorneys were exploring that option. The man who'd wielded authority so carelessly now navigated life without any, learning what it meant to be powerless in systems designed to protect those with credentials and status. Anderson used the settlement money to establish the Civil Rights Documentation Fund, a non-profit providing resources to victims of police misconduct who lacked her institutional knowledge or financial resources. Legal aid. Video analysis. Expert witnesses. Documentation training. The foundation existed to help others do what she'd done, turn violation into evidence, injustice into litigation, trauma into accountability. The ripple effects extended in directions Anderson hadn't anticipated. The police department's reputation suffered measurably. Recruitment numbers dropped. Qualified candidates chose other agencies. Experienced officers requested transfers. The city council faced pressure from business leaders concerned that the department's damaged credibility would affect economic development. The footage became required viewing in 73 law schools across the country within the first year. Criminal procedure courses used it to illustrate Fourth Amendment violations. Evidence classes analyzed Anderson's real-time narration as an example of creating contemporaneous documentation. Legal writing professors pointed to her precise language as a model of clarity under pressure. Police academies incorporated it too, though their lessons focused on what Rogers should have done differently. Verify identity. De-escalate. Recognize that authority requires judgment, not just assertion. The footage became a cautionary tale with a $850,000 price tag attached. Anderson returned to her regular docket, presiding over cases with the same methodical fairness she'd maintained throughout her career. But attorneys noticed something different now: a sharper attention to Fourth Amendment issues, a willingness to scrutinize police testimony more carefully, a reduced tolerance for procedural shortcuts that might have passed unexamined before. She spoke publicly about the experience 3 times. Once at an NAACP annual meeting. Once at a legal conference on civil rights litigation. Once at a community forum on police reform. Her message remained consistent: status provides no immunity from bias. Education doesn't prevent profiling. Authority doesn't guarantee fair treatment. The law protects everyone in theory, but application remains uneven. What changed outcomes wasn't her position as a federal judge. Rogers had dismissed that claim immediately. What changed outcomes was documentation, witnesses, and a system that eventually, grudgingly, slowly, produced accountability. The Federal Department of Justice opened a pattern and practice investigation into the police department 4 months after the verdict. Their preliminary findings supported what Anderson's lawsuit had alleged: systemic racial disparities in traffic stops, inadequate training, minimal accountability for officers with complaint histories, and a culture that prioritized solidarity over public trust. The city entered into a consent decree, federal oversight that would last at least 5 years, requiring quarterly reports on traffic stop data, use of force statistics, complaint investigations, and training implementation. The decree turned Anderson's individual lawsuit into structural reform that would outlast everyone involved in the original incident. Other victims contacted the Civil Rights Documentation Fund. Their stories varied in details but shared the same fundamental pattern: stopped without clear cause, searched without legal justification, treated with suspicion that correlated more with race than behavior. Most had filed complaints that went nowhere. Most lacked the resources to pursue litigation. Most had simply absorbed the indignity and moved on because no alternative seemed viable. Anderson's case changed that calculation. It demonstrated that accountability was possible, that documentation mattered, that patterns eventually became evidence if enough people refused to accept violations as normal. The class action lawsuit expanded to 43 plaintiffs. Many would receive modest settlements, a few $1,000s each, but the collective impact mattered more than individual compensation. The lawsuit forced the department to confront data it had ignored, patterns it had dismissed, and a culture that had prioritized protecting officers over serving the public. 2 years after the arrest, the department's traffic stop data showed measurable changes. Racial disparities still existed but had narrowed. Officers issued fewer pretextual stops. Use of force incidents declined. Complaint investigations took complaints seriously. The changes were incremental, incomplete, and required constant monitoring, but they represented movement in a direction that had seemed impossible before a federal judge was handcuffed in her own driveway. Anderson continued her work on the bench, her reputation enhanced rather than diminished by the experience. Her judicial opinions on constitutional law carried added authority now. She'd lived the violations she was interpreting, understood the gap between legal theory and lived reality, and refused to let abstract principles obscure concrete harms. The dashcam footage continued circulating. Over 1 million views across various platforms. Comment sections filled with stories of similar experiences, expressions of outrage, debates about reform. The footage became part of a larger conversation about policing, race, accountability, and the distance between law as written and law as experienced. And somewhere in that conversation, in those 1 million views, in those 73 law schools and countless police academies, Anderson's quiet narration continued documenting violations, building evidence, turning one afternoon's injustice into an educational legacy that would outlive everyone present that Tuesday at 2:15 p.m. Justice, Anderson learned, wasn't just about individual vindication. It was about creating precedents that protected people who came after. It was about documentation that couldn't be dismissed. It was about refusing to let violations disappear into the category of isolated incidents when patterns proved otherwise. The handcuff marks on her wrists had faded within a week. The legal precedent would last decades. The city paid $850,000. But the real cost, the damaged reputation, the federal oversight, the lost recruitment, the national attention, would compound for years. Reform came with a price tag that dwarfed any settlement. And in the end, that was the point. Accountability couldn't be cheap, or it wasn't accountability at all. This case transformed one woman's trauma into a national teaching moment, proving that documentation, composure, and persistence can force systems to change. If you believe stories like this matter, that sunlight remains the best disinfectant for injustice. Subscribe for more cases where ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances collide to create real reform.